scripture this morning is Deuteronomy 30:15 through 20. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, that I am commanding you today by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then ye shall live and become numerous. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away, and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that ye shall perish. Ye shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose the life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him and holding fast to him. For that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob.
We are continuing this morning hearing and learning about the Sermon on the Mount, a portion of it, and the portion that we're going to hear about today is from Matthew 5, chapter 17 through 20. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes.
May God bless the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words this morning. I have to start this morning by apologizing. I have to apologize to all of those who were in the board meeting last week, because as I said in the board meeting last week, that we are going to continue on with this Sermon on the Mount talk, but we would start reading more than 3 or 4 verses at a time. I spoke too soon, because it seems that this week we read 4 verses again. So I apologize. Next week, I believe it's 5. So we're slowly moving forward with that promise. But we're going to get there. And so we have again 4 verses here in Matthew, where the crowds gathered around Jesus, and Jesus spoke to the crowds, Jew and Gentile, men and women, you and me. Jesus teaches them. He teaches in his role as a teacher, in his role as a rabbi to the people. He teaches in his role as the voice of God for the people of God. And so what does he say in these 4 verses? Basically, we can break it down to this, where Jesus stands in front of them and says, let's not forget everything that has come before us. That was good stuff. Remember all that was said back then. And let's look at it. Let's study it. Let's read it. Let's understand it. And let's see how it reveals the world to us today. And let's see how we can use it in the world today. Jesus is talking about the laws and the prophet. He is talking about all that was written down in the Hebrew Bible. Now, I want to pause real quick and talk just for a real brief second about some of the language that I'm going to use in this sermon and in the sermons to come. Throughout the years, people have been referring to the two different sections in the Bible as the Old Testament and the New Testament. But I'm going to be using some different terms. I'm going to be calling it the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Testament. Now, you don't have to. If you grew up in that tradition, that is fine. But let me explain why I'm talking about it this way. And the example I'm going to use is cell phones. So let's look at our cell phones this day. The older our cell phone gets, the less relevant we think it is, the more outdated it becomes, and the more or less useful we believe that is. And so what do? We throw it away, or hopefully we recycle the phone, and we get a new cell phone, a brand new cell phone that can do all of the things that old cell phone just could not do, because the old cell phone was obsolete. And so you label them, oh, my old cell phone, and then my new cell phone. Oh, my new cell phone can do so many things that my old cell phone never could do. I'm so glad we got rid of that old cell phone. And that's what I'm trying to avoid this morning. For when we label something old and new, we tend to forget about that which we labeled old, thinking that it is obsolete, thinking that it is no longer relevant, that it has nothing to do in our world today. And that is not the case. And now I'm not saying that that people in this room believe that. I don't think you do. Just want to let you know. Everything written in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Testament, has relevance, needs to be heard today, no matter when it has been written. And this is what Jesus is telling the crowds this morning as he's teaching on the Mount. We still have to listen to all that has been said before us because it still has meaning. It still has relevance. And it can still teach us on many aspects of our relationship with God and our relationship with one another. From the greatest commandment to the least commandment, everything needs to be understood, needs to be followed, needs to be acted upon. All that Jesus is teaching to us, all that we have learned in the Gospels and the Christian Testament is based upon what he knew in the Hebrew Bible. Jesus is not telling us anything new. What he is doing is saying, let's look at it just a little bit different. Because as it was written then, things aren't really exactly the same now. To quote a professor of mine that I had in seminary, as she wrote in one of the commentaries, Dr. Lisa Davison said, while continuing interpretation of the law was necessary to meet changing circumstances, the content of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, was eternal. No one had the authority to make any changes to God's law, not even Jesus. The law is the same. How we read and interpret the law changes as we live and grow. This includes the 10 Commandments. This includes those 613 laws that the Jewish people chose to follow. This includes moral law, that was understood by the community. These are all the laws that are being seen as the greatest all the way down to the least. And what we need to understand is that in the eyes of the Jewish people who chose to follow these laws, this was a way to bring themselves in a closer relationship with God. It was a way for them to show other people around them that they had a strong relationship with God. Following these weren't a punishment, but an acknowledgement that they were in that covenant, the back and forth of the covenant with God. This was a way for a community to come together, to understand each other, to be beside each other as you do these things together. The law was created to bring together the people in a community of peace, in a community of justice, and in a community of faith. It was a way to let other people show how God wanted this world to act and to live. For as God was faithfully committed in everything that God did to the Hebrew people, this gave the people an opportunity to show God that they too were faithfully committed. But this morning, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that you've got to go read all the 613 laws that were in there and follow it exactly. Because that's not what we do. As we have grown in our faith and as the Christian tradition has grown, things have changed. This is one of the things that have changed. We don't follow the 613 rules, but we can follow the heart that is behind the 613 rules. Because the heart of the Torah is what Jesus is telling us to understand. The heart of the laws, the heart of the prophets as they spoke about those laws to the people. We do not need to follow each and every one of the rules, but we need to understand what it was that the rules meant and did and showed the other people about relationships with God. Following the rules meant that people had this relationship. It meant that they were in community with one another. It meant that they were living and striving in this world for peace, for justice, for mercy, and for a connection with everyone. This is what they were doing when they decided to follow these laws. And we are still called by Jesus to heed the laws, to understand what the laws were, and understand why exactly the laws were being followed. They are not the rules that you have to follow to receive God's salvation. We are given that through God's grace. But in verse 19, we read the words, "Therefore, who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." It seems that with this verse, heaven is open. If you don't follow the laws, and you teach others not to follow the laws, and we're not talking about the letter of the law. We're talking about the heart, the spirit of the law. You're going to be least in heaven, but you're in heaven. And then those who follow and teach the spirit of the law that God gives to us, that Jesus teaches to us, will be greater in heaven. To teach the heart of the Torah, to teach peace, mercy, justice, you will be great in heaven. And then it goes on to say in verse 20, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Thomas Long wrote this: Jesus is not calling his hearers to determine how righteous the scribes and the Pharisees are and then to do them one better. No. The followers of Jesus are called to be a different kind of righteousness. A righteousness that seeks to be ever expressive with the merciful, forgiven, reconciling will of God that lies at the center of the law. The scribes and the Pharisee knew the law backwards and forwards, and they followed the letter of the law each and every time. But there were times when they missed the spirit of the law. We are called to understand the spirit of the law, the compassion, the love, the peace, and the justice that the law of God brings to the world. Jesus is teaching us to understand everything that we have been taught, to live a life that knows all of God's goodness, not just the recent things that God has given to us. If we are going to have a complete and a covenantal relationship with God, we need to understand everything that is being taught to us by every writer, every person, every race, creed, sex, so that we can fully understand God. Jesus came to show us the importance of the laws and the prophets. He has come to make sure that we don't forget everything that we have been taught, pushing it aside for that which we have been recently shown. It is from both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Testament that we learn about our relationship with God, and that will help us in our relationship with others. Jesus, later on in the sermon in chapter 7, verse 12, sums up in one verse where he says, everything you do to others, in everything do to others as you would have them do to you. For this is the law and the prophets. In everything you do to others, do as you would do unto yourself. This is the law and the prophets. Jesus continues to understand and learn from the past, hearing what they were saying, understanding it, and then applying it to his time and his situation. We too need to understand everything that we have been taught in the past. We need to understand everything that the Hebrew Bible gives to us. Listen to it, take it in, understand it, and then apply it to where we are here and now. For the message is the same. How it applies has changed. The laws are the same. How they are followed have changed. The commandments are the same. What we do with them is up to us. Because we need to understand the words of God, old and new. We need to interpret them through the heart of the Gospels and of the Torah. We are called to live out the teachings, to understand the laws. We are called to hear all the words given to us with our heart and with mercy and justice and righteousness for all of the world. We are to live this. We are to continue to teach this. And we are to fulfill everything in all that we do. Amen.